On December 17, 1944, a column of American trucks ground through the frozen dark of eastern Belgium, carrying tired men toward a battle most of them did not yet understand. The men in those trucks belonged to the 30th Infantry Division, and they had been pulled out of the line only days before, promised rest they would never get. Somewhere in the cold, a radio crackled to life. It was not their own. It was a German broadcast, beamed in English across the front, and the voice on it was a woman the soldiers had nicknamed Axis Sally. She spoke to them directly, almost sweetly, as if she knew exactly which units were moving and where. And then she said the thing that several of the men would remember for the rest of their lives. She called them the fanatical 30th Division. She called them Roosevelt's SS troops. The men in the trucks did not feel fanatical. They felt exhausted. Many of them were National Guardsmen from the Carolinas, from Tennessee, from Georgia, farm boys and mill hands and clerks who had been civilians a few years earlier. They had not chosen the name. The enemy had given it to them. And what is strange, what is worth pausing on before we go any further, is the tone in which it was meant. It was meant as an insult. It was meant to unsettle them, to brand them as something cruel and inhuman in the dark before a fight. But the men did not flinch from it. By the end of the war, some of them would wear it almost with pride. A major in the division even sketched a new patch, combining the division's old initials with the lightning runes of the SS and the initials of the president. It was never approved. But the fact that a soldier even drew it tells you something about how the men received the name their enemy spat at them. So here is the question that this story exists to answer. Why would the German war machine, which had its own actual SS, fanatical, ideologically driven, responsible for some of the worst crimes in human history, why would that machine reach for the word SS to describe a division of American citizen soldiers from the rural South? What had these farm boys and mill hands done to earn, from their enemy, a comparison to the most feared troops the enemy possessed? The answer is not what propaganda wanted you to think. The answer is far more interesting than fanaticism. And to understand it, we have to follow these men from the hedgerows of Normandy to the ruins of German cities and meet the soldiers, the real ones, whose names are written in the record. If this story moves you, a like helps it reach others who care about these men. And if you are new here, consider subscribing, because this channel exists to keep these stories from being forgotten. The first thing to understand is that the nickname was not the casual invention of a single radio broadcast. By the winter of 1944, the 30th Infantry Division had already collided with the German army again and again, and each time, the Germans came away with the same uncomfortable impression. This was a division that did not break when it was supposed to break. It did not retreat when the situation called for retreat. It absorbed blows that should have shattered it, and it kept coming forward. Captured German prisoners and German radio alike began referring to it with a mix of contempt and unease. The label Roosevelt's SS was the crude shorthand for a feeling the enemy could not quite name. They were trying to describe a kind of stubbornness they did not expect from Americans, and certainly did not expect from a National Guard outfit that, on paper, looked utterly ordinary. And that word, ordinary, is the key to everything that follows. Because the 30th was ordinary, at least in its origins. It was a federalized National Guard division, its roots in the southeastern United States. Its nickname Old Hickory borrowed from Andrew Jackson, the frontier general and president whose toughness the men liked to claim as their inheritance. It was not a glamorous airborne unit. It was not a famous armored division with a household name. It was a line infantry division, the kind that did the grinding, unspectacular, lethal work of pushing the German army backward, one field, one town, one ruined street at a time. The Germans were not puzzled by the 30th because it was exotic. They were puzzled because it was plain, and yet it fought like something out of their nightmares. To find out why, we have to go back before the famous battles, to a quieter and far more important question. What turns an ordinary division into one the enemy fears? It is tempting to imagine some secret, some special weapon, and some elite selection process. There was none. What the 30th had was something less dramatic and far more durable. It had leadership that stayed, training that stuck, and a way of fighting that did not depend on any single man surviving. Its commander for nearly the entire war was Major General Leland Hobbs, a West Point graduate who had been a classmate of both Eisenhower and Omar Bradley. Hobbs was not a flashy general, he was a steady one, and under him, the division developed a reputation among the senior American commanders long before the Germans ever coined their nasty little nickname. That reputation was eventually put into words by a man whose judgment carried enormous weight. Colonel S.L.A. Marshall was the United States Army's chief combat historian in Europe, a man whose entire job was to study how American units actually performed under fire, stripped of the boasting and the press releases. After the war, Marshall and a team of about 35 historical officers reviewed the records of the divisions that had fought across Europe. And in March of 1946, Marshall wrote to General Hobbs with their conclusion. They had ranked the 30th as the #1 division on their list of first-category divisions. They felt, he wrote, that the 30th was the outstanding infantry division in the European theatre of operations. Sit with that for a moment. Of all the American divisions that fought their way across France, Belgium, and Germany, the men whose job it was to judge them coldly and professionally placed this one, this unremarkable Guard division from the rural South, at the very top. That is the real foundation of the legend. The German nickname was propaganda, the American assessment was evidence, and the rest of this story is about how an ordinary division earned an extraordinary verdict, paid for in a currency that never shows up in the highlight reels. It was paid for in days. The 30th spent 282 days in combat. It bled in 5 separate campaigns, and the men who carried it through those days were not supermen. They were exactly the kind of people you would have passed on the street in any small American town, which is precisely what makes what they did so hard to look away from. It is worth dwelling on who these men actually were, because the contrast with the SS comparison is so total. A National Guard division was, by its nature, rooted in specific American communities. The 30th drew its men from the Carolinas, from Tennessee, from Georgia, regions of farms and mill towns and small cities. In peacetime, the Guard had been the part-time army of the citizen, men who held ordinary jobs and trained on weekends, who knew each other from their hometowns, who in some cases had grown up together before they ever put on a uniform. When the war came and the division was federalized and sent overseas, that local character did not entirely wash out. These were not professional soldiers bred from birth for war, nor zealots raised in a cult of the state. They were clerks and farmers and machinists who had been handed rifles and asked to cross an ocean and break the most powerful army in Europe. The thing the Germans mistook for fanatical menace grew out of the most unglamorous soil imaginable, the ordinary working life of the American South. That is the irony at the center of the whole story, and it only deepens as we follow the men into battle. But to understand how leadership and training translate into the thing the Germans feared, we cannot stay at the level of generals and historians. We have to drop down into the dirt, into the specific fields and towns where the division's character was forged. And before the famous hilltop stand that made the division's name, there was Normandy, where the men first learned the terrible arithmetic of the war they had entered. The 30th came ashore at Omaha Beach on June 11, 1944, 5 days after the initial landings, into a Normandy that had already become a slaughterhouse of a particular kind. The fighting there was dominated by the hedgerows, the ancient earthen banks topped with dense vegetation that the Norman farmers had used for centuries to divide their fields. For the soldiers, each of these fields became a small fortress, and each one had to be taken at close range, often a few yards at a time, against an enemy who knew the ground and had prepared it for defense. The division learned, as every division learned in that country, that progress was measured in fields and paid for in friends. The grand sweeping maneuvers that armies dream of were impossible here. There was only the grind, the patient and bloody business of clearing one hedge line and then facing the next one exactly like it. By late July, the American command had decided to break the deadlock with a single massive blow. The plan was called Operation Cobra, and its purpose was to blast a hole clean through the German defences west of the town of Saint-Lô, through which armoured forces could then pour and finally turn the slow attrition of Normandy into a war of movement. The 30th was placed at the very centre of this effort, on the ground where the breakthrough was meant to happen. To open the way, the American Air Forces would deliver one of the heaviest concentrations of bombing yet attempted in support of ground troops, a carpet of explosives laid directly in front of the waiting infantry. What happened next was one of the war's most painful lessons in the dangers of that kind of power. On the 24th, and again on the 25th of July, waves of American heavy bombers flew over the front to lay their bombs on the German lines. But the markings on the ground were imperfect, the wind drifted the smoke, and some of the bomb loads fell short, landing not on the German defenders, but on the American infantry waiting to attack. The men of the 30th, who were meant to be shielded by that bombing, were instead caught beneath it. The short bombing killed and wounded scores of them over those 2 days. Among the dead, on the second day, was a senior American general, Leslie McNair, who had come forward to observe the attack and was killed by his own side's bombs, the highest-ranking American officer to die by such fire in the European war. It is worth pausing on what that did to the men. They had endured the hedgerows. Now, on the eve of the great attack, they had been bombed by their own air force, twice. And yet, when the order came to advance through the smoke and the craters and the bodies of their own dead, the division got up and attacked. Operation Cobra succeeded. The German line west of Saint-Lô was torn open, the American armour poured through the gap, and the long stalemate of Normandy finally broke into the open warfare that would carry the Allies across France. The 30th had been at the hinge of that breakthrough, and it had reached the hinge by walking forward, through ground its own aircraft had just turned against it. The men who could do that, after what they had just suffered, were already becoming the division the enemy would learn to fear. It was in the wake of that breakthrough, with the German army in France beginning to come apart, that the 30th moved into the area around a small town that would give the division its first true legend. The town was called Mortain, and above it rose a bald hilltop, the maps labelled Hill 314. In the first week of August 1944, the situation in Normandy had finally cracked open in the Allies' favour. The 30th Division had just moved into the area around Mortain, relieving another unit, settling into positions that seemed, for the moment, relatively quiet. The men did not know that Adolf Hitler had personally ordered a massive counterattack aimed straight at them. The German plan, code-named Operation Lüttich, was to drive a powerful armoured fist westward to the sea at Avranches, cutting off the American spearheads that were racing south. To do it, the Germans assembled elements of several panzer divisions, hundreds of tanks gathering in the dark. The blow that fell on Mortain and the high ground beside it came chiefly from the 2nd SS Panzer Division, known as Das Reich, and the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, with other armoured formations, including part of the 1st SS Panzer Division, committed to the wider offensive. And the hinge of the entire German attack, the ground that had to be taken for the plan to work, included a bald hill just east of Mortain. On that hill sat roughly 700 men, most of them from the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment. When the German assault crashed in during the early hours of August 7th, those men were quickly cut off, surrounded, and left to fend for themselves on an exposed hilltop, with the German army flowing around them on every side. They had no easy way out. They had limited food, limited ammunition, and limited medical supplies. What they had, crucially, was observation. From the top of Hill 314, they could see for miles in every direction. They could see the German tanks and trucks and infantry moving below them. And they had radios, and they had men who knew how to use them. Among those men was a young field artillery observer, First Lieutenant Robert Weiss, of the 230th Field Artillery Battalion. From his position on the hill, Weiss and his fellow observers became the eyes of the entire American defense. Every time German armor tried to move along the roads below, every time German infantry massed for an assault, the men on the hill called down artillery fire with deadly precision. They were, in effect, directing a storm of steel onto an enemy who could not understand where the accuracy was coming from. The Germans threw attack after attack at the hill, trying to clear the observers off the high ground. The Americans on top held, even as their numbers dwindled and their wounded multiplied, with no way to evacuate them. For 5 days, the men on Hill 314 refused to be driven off. They endured artillery, infantry assaults, hunger, thirst, and the slow agony of watching friends die without proper aid. The situation of the wounded was especially terrible. With the hill surrounded, there was no way to carry the injured men down to safety and proper medical care. They lay where they fell, tended as best the others could manage, while their condition worsened by the hour. Food ran low, then ran out. Water became precious. Ammunition for the all-important defense had to be hoarded and counted. The Germans, knowing how much depended on taking the hill, sent demands for surrender up to the trapped Americans, pointing out the obvious, that the men were cut off, outnumbered, and doomed. The Americans on the hill refused. At one point, the Americans tried to resupply the surrounded men through sheer ingenuity. Aircraft attempted to drop supplies, though much of it drifted into German hands or was destroyed. In one of the more remarkable improvisations of the campaign, the artillery tried to fire medical supplies up to the men on the hill, packing them into shells so that the desperately needed materials could be lofted over the German lines to the defenders. Not all of these efforts succeeded, and the men on the hill continued to suffer. But through every hour of it, the observers kept calling fire. They kept their radios working. They kept their eyes on the roads below, and the storm of American artillery they directed kept falling on the German columns, trying to push west. Because they held that hill, the entire German offensive below them was strangled. The roads the panzers needed were swept by artillery the observers were guiding. The momentum the Germans needed evaporated. Operation Lüttich, Hitler's grand stroke to split the American army, failed. And it failed in significant part because 700 surrounded men on a bare hill would not let go of it. The cost was severe. The battalion on the hill was reduced to a fraction of its strength, but the strategic result was enormous. The failure of the Mortain counterattack helped open the way for the Allies to encircle and destroy a huge portion of the German army in the Falaise pocket in the weeks that followed. The stand at Mortain was one of those rare moments where the stubbornness of ordinary infantrymen changed the shape of a campaign. Decades later, in 2020, the United States Army formally recognized the division for this action, awarding it a Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism at Mortain in August of 1944. The recognition came late, more than 75 years late, but the men had earned it in real time, on a hilltop, with the German army all around them. Now, here is where the German assumption should have been confirmed. By every logic of war, a surrounded battalion, cut off from supply and reinforcement, low on everything, facing SS panzer troops, should have been overrun or forced to surrender. That is what surrounded units in most armies, in most of history, were expected to do. The 30th did not do it. And this is the first hint of the thing the Germans found so unsettling. It was not fanaticism, it was something quieter and harder to fight. It was a refusal to accept that the situation was hopeless, combined with the training to keep functioning, keep observing, keep calling fire, even when isolated and afraid. The men on Hill 314 were not waiting for orders that could not reach them. They were doing their jobs, and their jobs happened to be holding the hinge of an entire German offensive. Mortain revealed what the division could do on the defensive, surrounded and outnumbered. But a defensive stand, however heroic, only tells you part of a unit's character. The harder test, the one that separates good divisions from truly formidable ones, is what happens when that same unit has to go forward, into prepared defenses, into the enemy's own fortified homeland, and grind through it. For the 30th, that test came 2 months later, at the first great German city to stand in the Allies' path. Its name was Aachen. By October 1944, the war had reached the western border of Germany itself. There, the Germans had built the Siegfried Line, a deep belt of concrete bunkers, pillboxes, dragon's teeth and minefields designed to bleed any attacker white. And anchoring that line in the path of the American advance was Aachen, an ancient city of deep symbolic importance to the German nation, the old imperial city of Charlemagne. Hitler ordered it held to the last. For the 30th Division, the task was brutal and specific. Working as part of the larger American effort, the division had to break through the Siegfried Line north of the city and then drive south to link up with another division, encircling Aachen and sealing its defenders inside. There was nothing elegant about this fighting. It was a contest of flesh against concrete. American infantrymen had to advance across open ground swept by machine gun fire, reach individual pillboxes, and destroy them one at a time with explosives, flamethrowers, and raw nerve. The German defenders fought from positions specifically engineered to be nearly impossible to take, and the price the 30th paid was staggering. In one instance during this fighting, a single company lost dozens of men in roughly an hour. In another, a German artillery concentration fell on a company and killed or wounded the overwhelming majority of its men in a matter of moments. These were not abstract statistics to the men who lived through them. These were friends, gone in an afternoon, in numbers that are hard to even comprehend. The Germans fought ferociously to keep the city, precisely because of what it represented to them, and they did everything they could to keep the encirclement from closing. So the German command poured strength into holding the corridor open and into trying to break the American ring once it began to form. As the 30th drove south of the city to link hands with the other American division coming up from below, the Germans launched repeated, furious counterattacks against the thin neck of ground the Americans were trying to seal. Over the days of fighting around the city, the equivalent of many German battalions was fed into these counterattacks and consumed against the men holding the line. The 30th absorbed those blows, held the corridor, and squeezed it shut. It was in this grinding nightmare around Aachen that one soldier's actions captured exactly what made the division so dangerous to the enemy and so costly to itself. His name was Staff Sergeant Jack Pendleton of Company 1, 120th Infantry Regiment. On October 12, 1944, near the town of Badenburg, Pendleton's company was pinned down by intense German machine gun fire that made any movement suicidal. The advance had stalled, men were trapped, and the German guns dominated everything in front of them. Pendleton understood that as long as those guns could fire freely, his comrades could not move, and the longer they stayed pinned, the more of them would die. What he did next is the kind of act that the word heroism was invented to describe, and still fails to fully capture. Pendleton deliberately drew the German fire onto himself. He moved into the open, exposing his own body to the machine guns, so that a second squad could maneuver against the German position while the enemy's attention and bullets were fixed on him. He was hit. He was killed. But in giving his life to draw that fire, he opened the path for his fellow soldiers to advance and take the position that had stopped them. For this, Jack Pendleton was awarded the Medal of Honor, posthumously. He never knew that the nation had recognized what he did. He only knew, in his final moments, that the men he served with needed someone to draw the fire, and that he was the one in position to do it. This is the second piece of the puzzle the Germans could not solve. At Mortain, the division would not break when surrounded. At Aachen, it would not stop when bleeding. And the reason was not that the men were unafraid. The reason was that, at every level, from generals down to individual sergeants, there were men prepared to do the hard, often fatal thing that the moment required, without being told, without hesitating, because they understood what was at stake for the men beside them. Pendleton was not following a grand strategic plan. He was solving the specific, immediate, deadly problem in front of him, and he solved it with his life. Aachen finally fell in late October, the first major German city captured by the Allies. The Siegfried Line, in that sector, had been cracked open by infantrymen with explosives and unbearable courage. But the division barely had time to absorb its losses before the war demanded everything from it again, in the most famous battle of the entire Western Front, in the snow and fog of the Ardennes. And it was there, on those frozen roads, that the men of the 30th would first hear themselves called Roosevelt's SS. In the middle of December 1944, The German army launched its last great offensive in the west, a massive surprise attack through the forested hills of the Ardennes, in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The German plan depended on speed. Powerful armored columns were to race westward through the thinly held American line, seize crossings over the Meuse River, and drive on toward the port of Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies in two. The tip of the northern spearhead was an elite battle group from the 1st SS Panzer Division, led by a hard, aggressive SS officer named Joachim Peiper. Speed was everything for Peiper. Every hour he was delayed, the more time the Americans had to recover and block him. The 30th Division was one of the units thrown into his path. There is a grim symmetry here that the men themselves recognized. At Mortain, back in August, the 30th had helped break a great German armored counterstroke, one that had included the 1st SS Panzer Division among its formations. Now, in December, in the snow, they were being sent to stop that same SS Division again, its tanks once more leading a desperate German lunge toward a distant objective. The enemy they had bloodied in the summer was back, and once more the 30th stood across its road. It was during the urgent move to the front, in those trucks in the cold, that the men heard the German broadcast naming them, sneering at them, calling them the fanatical 30th, Roosevelt's SS. What followed was a series of vicious, confused, deadly small unit fights in towns whose names the survivors would never forget. The division, along with attached tank and tank destroyer units and combat engineers, fought to hold villages and crossroads against Peiper's armor. The engineers blew bridges in the spearhead's face, denying it the roads and the fuel it desperately needed. The infantry fought German tanks at close range in narrow streets, where a man with the right weapon and enough nerve could destroy a vehicle worth far more than himself. The weather was brutal, the visibility often near zero, and the stakes absolute. If Peiper broke through, the whole northern shoulder of the American line was in danger. The fighting concentrated in a handful of Belgian towns along the line of Peiper's advance. At Stavelot, the 30th fought to deny the German column the bridges over the Amblève River, the very crossings the armor needed to continue west. At Stoumont and the cluster of villages around it, American infantry and armor traded the ground back and forth in close, savage combat, sometimes holding a position, losing it, and retaking it within a day. The terrain helped the defenders. The narrow river valleys and the steep wooded slopes funneled Peiper's tanks onto a few predictable roads, and on those roads the men of the 30th and their attached units waited. A single well-placed gun, a blown bridge, a determined squad of infantry, any of these could halt a column of armor that had nowhere to maneuver. This was the heart of the matter for Peiper. His entire operation depended on speed and on fuel. He had been told to drive hard and fast for the distant river crossings, and he had been forced to rely in part on capturing American fuel dumps along the way, because the German war machine no longer had enough of its own. The 30th and the other American units in his path understood this, even if only by instinct and circumstance. Every bridge the engineers dropped, every hour the infantry made him fight for a village, drained away the time and the fuel he could not replace. His powerful tanks, the pride of the German armored force, became liabilities when they ran dry. Some of the most formidable armored vehicles of the war ended the battle abandoned by the roadside, not destroyed in combat, simply out of fuel, their crews fleeing on foot. The 30th had helped turn Peiper's great thrust into a trap that swallowed it. It was in this fighting, near Malmedy, on December 21, 1944, that a young soldier named Francis Curry did something that would put his name permanently into the record of the war. Curry was a sergeant in Company K of the 120th Infantry Regiment. He had been born in 1925 in upstate New York, orphaned young, raised in a foster home, an ordinary young American by any measure. On that December morning, his unit was hit hard by German infantry and tanks, and the situation rapidly became desperate. Several of his comrades were pinned down and trapped in a building, with German armor closing in and the position threatening to collapse entirely. What Curry did over the next stretch of time reads almost like fiction, except that it was witnessed, documented and verified. He used a variety of weapons in succession as the situation demanded. He fired a bazooka at the German tanks. He used anti-tank grenades. He took up a Browning automatic rifle and a machine gun. Moving across exposed ground under heavy fire, he engaged German armor and infantry, knocking out enemy positions and forcing tanks to withdraw. Crucially, his actions broke the German pressure long enough to allow 5 of his trapped comrades to escape from the building where they had been cut off. He had, almost single-handedly, and turned a collapsing situation back into a defensible one. For this, Francis Curry received the Medal of Honor. The award was presented the following summer, in July of 1945, by Major General Hobbs himself, the division's commander, at a ceremony at Reims. Curry survived the war. He lived a long life, became a counselor for veterans, and in time became one of the last surviving Medal of Honor recipients from the Second World War. He died in October of 2019, at the age of 94. There is even a small, strange piece of Americana attached to him. In the late 1990s, an action figure was modeled on his likeness, a quiet acknowledgement that this orphan from upstate New York had become, in the truest sense, an American hero. Curry was not the only man of the 30th to perform such deeds in those December days. Just 2 days after Curry's stand, on December 23rd, near a Belgian hamlet, another soldier of the same regiment faced a similar nightmare. Staff Sergeant Paul Bolden, of Company I, 120th Infantry, learned that a house ahead was occupied by a strong force of German SS troops, around 35 of them, whose fire was holding up the American advance. Together with a fellow sergeant, Russell Snowd, Bolden chose to assault the house directly. The 2 men charged toward it under heavy fire. Snowd was killed in the attempt, an act of courage that would be recognized with a posthumous award for his sacrifice. Bolden reached the building and threw himself into the fight. He attacked the enemy inside, killing roughly 20 of them in the first assault. He himself was severely wounded in the process, badly enough that most men would have, understandably, pulled back to seek aid. Bolden did not. Despite his wounds, he went back into the fight and killed the remaining defenders, finishing what he and Snowd had started together. For this, Paul Bolden received the Medal of Honor. He survived the war and lived until 1979. There is a detail in his story worth noting, given the name the enemy had hung on his division. The men Bolden fought in that house were SS troops, the genuine article, the soldiers of the very organization the Germans had accused the 30th of resembling. So here was one of Roosevelt's so-called SS, a staff sergeant from the American South, wounded and refusing to stop, clearing a house of the real ones. His story, like Curry's, like Pendleton's, is the kind of thing that, told around a campfire, would sound exaggerated. The difference is that these are not campfire tales. They are in the official record, attested and confirmed. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ground to its bloody conclusion in January 1945, the German offensive had failed completely. Piper's spearhead had been stopped, cut off, and largely destroyed, its surviving members eventually slipping back on foot, having abandoned the armor that ran out of fuel and road. The 30th had played a central role in blunting the northern shoulder of the German attack, standing once more in the path of the 1st SS Panzer Division and once more refusing to yield. The men who had been mocked as Roosevelt's SS on the radio had answered the insult in the only language the battlefield understood. Now we come to the deeper question, the one underneath all the battles. We have seen what these men did at Mortain, at Aachen, in the Ardennes, but doing is not the same as understanding. Why did this division, over and over, in situation after situation, behave in a way that the German army found so unnatural, so difficult to counter? The propaganda answer, fanaticism, is not just wrong, it is the opposite of the truth. Fanatics, in the true sense, are brittle. They depend on belief, on momentum, on the sense of being on the winning side. The men of the 30th had none of that. They had no grand ideology driving them up that hill at Mortain or into those pillboxes at Aachen. So what did they have? The answer lies in something far less cinematic than fanaticism and far more powerful. It lies in continuity, in cohesion, and in a particular kind of distributed competence. Consider the leadership. The 30th had the same commander, General Hobbs, for almost the entire war. That continuity at the top mattered, but the more important continuity was lower down, in the regiments and battalions and companies, where men trained together, fought together, and learned to trust the soldier beside them. When a division keeps its character intact, when its veterans pass their hard-won knowledge to the replacements who fill the gaps left by the dead, it develops a kind of institutional memory that cannot be created overnight and cannot be easily destroyed. Each terrible battle made the survivors more dangerous, because the lessons did not die with the men. They were absorbed into how the division fought. This point about replacements deserves a closer look, because it sits at the center of why some divisions held their character and others did not. A division like the 30th did not fight the entire war with the same faces. The casualties at Aachen alone tell you that. Companies were gutted and rebuilt, sometimes more than once. The men who fell were replaced by new soldiers, fresh from training depots, who arrived knowing the drills but knowing nothing of this particular division, these particular men, this specific way of doing things under fire. In a poorly run unit, that constant turnover is a kind of slow death, because each new man is a stranger who has to learn the hardest lessons from scratch, often in his first hours of combat, which are also frequently his last. But in a unit with strong cohesion and steady leadership, the veterans absorbed the replacements into the existing body of knowledge. The new man was taught, quickly and bluntly, what worked and what got you killed. The division's accumulated understanding of how to fight survived the loss of the individual men who had earned it. That is how a division can be bled white again and again and still grow more lethal rather than less. The knowledge outlived the knowers. And then there is the matter of who actually made decisions when everything fell apart. This is the part the German military tradition struggled with the most. In the German system, leadership and the authority to make consequential decisions were concentrated heavily in the officer corps, a group that was, by long tradition, somewhat set apart. The American army, by contrast, had built something different. It pushed initiative and decision-making downward, into the non-commissioned officers, the sergeants, and even the individual soldiers. Look again at the men we have met. Pendleton was a staff sergeant. Curry was a sergeant. Bolden was a staff sergeant. The observers holding Hill 314 included junior lieutenants doing work of strategic importance entirely on their own initiative, because they could see what needed doing, and no one had to tell them. It is worth being precise about this difference, because it is easy to state and hard to truly grasp. The German army was not a clumsy or unintelligent force. In many respects, its small unit tactics were among the finest in the world, and its soldiers were brave and skilled. The issue was structural and cultural. In the German tradition, the willingness and the authority to make a real decision, to look at a collapsing situation and invent a new plan on the spot, was understood to belong primarily to the officer. It was, in a sense, the defining quality of the officer class, something that set those men apart from the ranks below them. The non-commissioned officer, however experienced, was trained to execute a plan, not to author one. This worked beautifully, as long as the officers were present, and the plan still made sense. But war has a way of killing officers and rendering plans obsolete, often at the same moment, and when that happened, the German unit could find itself waiting for guidance that would never come. The American unit had no such bottleneck. The authority to decide had been distributed so widely that there was almost always someone present who was both willing and trained to take charge. When an officer fell, a sergeant stepped into his place without being told to. When that sergeant fell, the next man understood the purpose of the mission well enough to carry it forward. The competence was spread out, woven through the entire body of the unit, rather than locked in a few heads at the top. So you could hurt the 30th, badly, again and again, and still it kept functioning, kept adapting, kept coming. To an enemy expecting that cutting off the head would stop the body, this was deeply disturbing. The division behaved less like a single creature with one brain, and more like something with intelligence woven through every part of it. And here is the crucial point. Even after the Germans recognized this quality in their American opponents, they could not simply copy it. They could not, because copying it would have meant tearing down one of the oldest and most cherished structures in their entire military and social tradition, the wall between the men who were permitted to decide and the men who were only permitted to obey. That wall was not built from tactics or doctrine. It was built from culture, from a centuries-old idea about rank and birth and who was fit to lead. An army cannot vote to abolish its own deepest assumptions in the middle of a war. So the Germans were left in the strange position of being able to see clearly what made their enemy so resilient and being utterly unable to reproduce it. They had identified the secret, and the secret was useless to them, because the secret was the American society those soldiers came from, distilled into the way they fought. That is what the nickname Roosevelt's SS was really, clumsily, trying to describe. The Germans saw a unit that fought with a cohesion and a relentlessness they associated only with their own most fanatical formations. They reached for the most fearsome comparison they had, but they got the cause wrong. It was not fanaticism, it was the opposite in a sense. It was a free society's version of military strength, ordinary men, trained well, led steadily, trusted with real responsibility, and bound together by loyalty to one another, rather than to an ideology. The Germans saw the ferocity and assumed it came from some dark zeal. In truth, it came from mill hands and farmers who simply would not let down the man in the next foxhole. There is one more dimension to this that deserves honesty, because this story is meant to be true, not merely flattering. The nickname itself, Roosevelt's SS, did not descend from some formal pronouncement of the German High Command, as legend sometimes claims. The documented trail leads instead to enemy propaganda radio, to that broadcaster the men called Axis Sally, and to the general atmosphere of captured prisoners and German broadcasts referring to the division with a wary contempt. War correspondents picked it up. The division's own veterans recorded it. Over the years, the story has sometimes been embroidered with claims that German field marshals or the High Command itself bestowed the name. The careful truth is simpler and, if anything, more revealing. The name began as an insult from the enemy's propaganda machine, and the men chose to wear it as a badge. That choice, to take the worst thing your enemy calls you and make it your own, tells you a great deal about the spirit of the division. The fighting did not end with the Bulge. After the German offensive was crushed, the 30th turned eastward again, back toward Germany and the heart of the Reich. In February 1945, the division fought its way across the Roer River, one more water barrier in a country defended by them. The following month, it took part in one of the climactic operations of the war in the West, the crossing of the Rhine, the last great natural barrier protecting Germany. The Rhine was wide, fast, and heavily defended, and for centuries it had stood as the symbolic shield of the German nation. Forcing a crossing of it was among the most dangerous tasks an infantryman could be handed, because the assault troops had to cross open water in small boats, exposed, while the enemy fired on them from the far bank. On the night of the assault crossing in late March 1945, the 30th went over the river under a tremendous bombardment, the American guns hammering the far shore to suppress the defenders while the boats pushed across. The division established a foothold on the eastern bank and held it, opening the way for the forces that would follow. Beyond the Rhine lay the final campaign, the drive into the German interior against an enemy that was crumbling but still, in places, lethally dangerous. There was a particular cruelty to the fighting in these last weeks. The outcome of the war was no longer in any real doubt. Everyone, on both sides, could see that Germany was finished. And yet men kept dying, because pockets of German troops, some of them fanatical, some merely obedient, kept fighting, and every town still had to be cleared. In those final weeks, the division pushed deep into Germany, taking towns and cities as the Reich collapsed around them. It was during this period, in early April 1945, near the German town of Hamelin, that another soldier of the 30th earned the Medal of Honor. First Lieutenant Raymond Baudouin of Company F, 119th Infantry Regiment, led his men against fierce German resistance on April 6th. In the fighting, Baudouin repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to protect and direct his men, and he was killed leading them. His Medal of Honor, like Pendleton's, was awarded posthumously, a final addition to the division's long roll of men who gave everything in the last days of a war that was nearly won. That detail matters. Baudouin died after the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. He died because the job in front of him still had to be done, and he would not ask his men to do what he would not. As the division advanced through Germany in those last weeks, its men also came face to face with the true nature of the regime they had been fighting. Elements of the 30th, like many American units in that final push, encountered the Nazi camp system, the network of horror that the propaganda broadcasts had never mentioned. Soldiers who had been called Roosevelt's SS by the enemy now walked through the evidence of what the actual SS had done. The men who ran those camps, who carried out the murders and the starvation and the cruelty on an industrial scale, were the real thing the word SS described. And here were the Americans who had been mocked with that same name, standing among the survivors and the dead of the genuine article. There is a bitter clarity in that juxtaposition. The men who had been smeared with the SS name were among those who liberated the victims of the real thing. The United States Army would later formally recognize the 30th as a liberating division for its role in freeing prisoners from the Nazi camp network in those final April days. Whatever abstract reasons had sent them to war, whatever a farm boy from Georgia or a mill hand from the Carolinas had told himself about why he was crossing an ocean to fight, in those moments, the moral meaning of the entire struggle became impossible to mistake. They had not needed an ideology to make them fight well. But standing in those camps, they were given, in the plainest possible terms, the answer to any question about what the fight had been for. The thing the enemy had tried to make into a slur, the comparison to the SS, now revealed itself as the exact inversion of the truth. These men were the ones who opened the gates. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the 30th Infantry Division had compiled a record that justified, in cold and documented terms, the extraordinary assessment that Colonel Marshall's team would give it. 282 days in combat, 5 campaigns, several thousand of its men killed, with total battle casualties, the killed and wounded together, numbering in the tens of thousands across the war, a figure that becomes almost unbearable when you remember that a division's fighting strength was only a fraction of that number at any given time. Think about what that arithmetic actually means. A wartime infantry division had a certain authorized strength, but the men who did the close fighting and the dying, the riflemen at the very front, were only a portion of that total. When a division suffers battle casualties in the tens of thousands over its time in combat, it has, in effect, replaced its frontline infantry several times over. Every one of those casualties was a young man with a hometown and a family waiting for letters, and the 30th produced enough of them to fill the cemeteries and the hospitals and the grieving households of dozens of American towns. Numbers on a page cannot hold that. Each one was a particular face that someone, somewhere, never saw come home. Its men earned 6 medals of honor, 3 of them given to soldiers who did not live to receive them, along with many dozens of distinguished service crosses and well over 1,000 silver stars, and thousands more decorations for valor below those. Behind every single one of those medals was a specific man, in a specific field or street or ruined house, doing a specific terrible thing because it had to be done, and because the men beside him were counting on him to do it. The medals are not the point. They are only the visible markers of a courage that was, far more often, unwitnessed and unrecorded, spent by men whose names never made it into any citation. So let us return, at the end, to the men themselves, because that is where this story properly belongs. Not in the statistics, but in the people. Think of the observers on Hill 314, surrounded for 5 days, calling down fire while their friends died around them, holding the hinge of an entire campaign with little more than radios and refusal. Think of Jack Pendleton, stepping into the open at Badenburg to draw the machine guns onto himself so his comrades could live and move. Think of Francis Curry near Malmedy, the orphan from upstate New York, moving from weapon to weapon under fire, knocking out tanks, pulling 5 men out of a closing trap. Think of Paul Bolden, wounded and going back into that house to finish a fight his friend Snowd had died to begin. These men did not return home as fanatics. They returned home, those who returned at all, as bricklayers and farmers and clerks and councillors. Curry spent his later years helping other veterans carry the weight of what they had seen, working as a counsellor for men who had been through their own versions of the hell he had survived. He lived quietly into his 90s, and only at the very end of his long life did he become widely recognized as one of the last living links to that frozen December in Belgium. When he died, in the autumn of 2019, the country lost not only a hero, but a witness, one of the dwindling number of men who could still say, "I was there, I saw it, this is how it truly was." None of these men set out to become legends. They set out to do a job, to survive if they could, and above all not to fail the men beside them. The legend was something the enemy accidentally created, and the record later confirmed. It is worth remembering, too, that for every Curry or Bolden or Pendleton whose name we know, there were thousands of men in the 30th whose names we do not. The soldier who held the corner of a hedgerow so his friends could cross. The medic who crawled out under fire to drag back a wounded man and was never decorated for it. The replacement who arrived in the line one evening and was dead by the next, having had no time to become anyone's legend. The division was made of these men far more than it was made of its Medal of Honor recipients. The famous few stand in for the anonymous many, and the many are the real division. When the Germans looked across the battlefield and saw something that frightened them, it was not a handful of heroes they were seeing, it was an entire body of ordinary men who would not quit. And here, finally, is the answer to the question we began with. The Germans called this division Roosevelt's SS because they were looking at a kind of strength they did not understand and could not produce. They saw cohesion and assumed indoctrination. They saw relentlessness and assumed fanaticism. They saw a unit that would not break when surrounded, would not stop when bleeding, would not yield when its leaders fell, and they reached for the only comparison their imagination allowed, their own most feared troops. But they had it exactly backward. The 30th strength did not come from a regime or an ideology or a cult of a leader. It came from the most ordinary place imaginable. It came from steady leadership that stayed in place, from training that turned civilians into soldiers who could think for themselves, and from the simple, unbreakable loyalty of men who would not abandon one another. When the enemy tried to insult them by comparing them to the SS, the men of the 30th understood, perhaps better than the enemy did, just how wrong the comparison was. The SS drew its ferocity from hatred and from fear of its own masters. The 30th drew its ferocity from the man in the next hole. One was a weapon of a tyranny, the other was a tool of ordinary people defending something they could barely put into words. The Germans never solved the puzzle of why these unremarkable Americans fought the way they did. They could see the effect with perfect clarity. They simply could not see the cause, because the cause was the one thing their own system did not possess. Now you know what it was. Thank you for spending these minutes with the men of the 30th Infantry Division. If this story reached you, a like is the single best way to help it find others who care about this history. If you are not yet subscribed, this is a good moment, so that these stories keep finding the people who want to hear them. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your own family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, a neighbor whose stories you grew up hearing, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the ones you have just heard. Most of them never told it in full. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.